Yes. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. And as more show up, that's just fine. My name is Gavin Seim. I'm a candidate for the 4th Congressional District here in Washington. And we've got a few of us here today that were on the ground at the Bundy Ranch. We're going to cover various things. We have Anthony Bosworth, who was there with us. He actually got there before us, and a lot of us from Washington kind of coordinated. Anthony's looking to run for the Yakima County Sheriff down here as well. We have my brother Nathan, who went down with me. And let's guys go and come up here. We also have Josh. And Josh is, if he has anything to interject, he's welcome to jump in at any time, but he's going to kind of let us take point on it. But I'd like to, I think we should open in prayer here first and put that first. So let's start with that. God of the universe, we want to thank you for your mercy and the liberty you've given us. Thank you for the protection of life at the Bundy Ranch and for the courage of people in America who are willing to stand for the God-given liberty and the rights that we hold to be self-evident. We want to thank you for your goodness and for this sunny day. We want to ask you for wisdom and guidance, for prayer and forgiveness in America, and for the wisdom to turn to you and guide our country in a way that's right. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So, we're going to start. Hey guys, good to see you. First of all, does anybody need a copy of the Constitution here? Because we're going to bring this up a few times today, so if anybody wants one of these, by all means, then you just want to pass a few of those out. Anybody who doesn't have one, or even if you have one and you have a liberal friend who needs one, by all means, take an extra. There's always a Democrat in need of a Constitution. I also have my wife Sandra here, and my little ones in the back there who are very well behaved, and sometimes on Saturday afternoons, very excited. What we're going to do is we're going to cover a bit of an overview of what happened at the Bundy Ranch and what we saw there, what went down, despite what the often disturbingly slanted news media reports. And we're going to cover some of those bases, and then each of us are going to kind of give just some different input from different perspectives. My perspective tends to be from the federal government, constitutional, and congressional perspective. Anthony looks more from a law enforcement kind of perspective, and Nathan, as a patriot, looks at it as we all should. So, guys, let's start with the basis. And on Tuesday, before this all went down, we saw in the news the Bundy Ranch situation was forming. We saw a lot of social media going on saying that the federal government was overreaching and they had First Amendment zones and all this stuff. And my brother and I sat down and we looked at this, and I called and I got Clive Bundy on the phone. And I chatted with him for 10 or 15 minutes, and this was early on enough that you could actually get a hold of him. And I try to do this often, especially in the office I'm running for, because I like to be communicative. My platform is to put things out there and take them head on, but at the same time I like to make sure my facts are straight and that I know what I'm talking about. So I called directly and chatted with this man, and what I realized is this was not an anarchist looking for freebies or that just hates government. This was somebody who understood the Constitution, the foundations of America, and who wanted us to be focused on that. And I got off the phone and we were talking about going down there, Nathan and I said, I don't really, at this point, fully know all the legal issues, the land right issues, but one thing I can say, we do not have a government that says, this is the zone wherein you can practice the First Amendment. And when that line is crossed, it is our duty as patriots to step up and say no. The Bundy Ranch situation was not about cows. It was about liberty. It was about the government following the supreme law of the land right here that we the people laid upon them. And I see a lot of rhetoric in the news media about lawless ranchers and the candidates and the politicians that support them and how they shouldn't do this. And I want to look at these folks and say, yeah, come on, Harold. Have you read the Constitution? And I want to look at all these different news networks and people that are twisting the truth for whatever reason. Maybe they just genuinely don't understand how the Constitution works and how it reigns over the government in this nation. Maybe they're just genuinely ignorant of those facts. We need to have a conversation about liberty. We need to have a conversation on understanding of why this happens the way it happens, of why so many people spilled their blood in America to say, this is the law for government, and this is what you will follow. So Nathan and I, about 48 hours after, loaded up the RV, and we headed out down there. And it was about 1,200 miles, I think. And then en route, we were coordinating with some of the legislators from Washington State who were also standing up to this, Matt Shea, David Taylor, and we ended up connecting with Anthony, with Josh, who would hit the ground before us, and we're coordinating down there. And we'll kind of go forward from that, but Anthony, do you have anything to add to this in particular?
As much like Gavin was saying, I was concerned that if it was as it appeared to be, that we had a problem. And if the media wasn't correct, we still had a problem, either way. You listen to the media, it said one thing. You judge the facts for yourself, it said another thing. But either way, it left us with a problem. And I didn't know how to respond to it because I did not know the facts. I had a lot of people call me, what do we do about this? And my whole point was, I didn't know because I didn't know the facts. So that's when me and a couple friends decided we're going to go down and we're going to find out for ourselves. We had planned 3 days. We were going to go down, find out, and we were going to bring back the facts. And then we were going to spread those facts. We weren't going to go by what the mainstream media was telling us because they weren't in agreement. And if it was as it appeared, the American people as a society had to respond one way or another. They left us no choice but to respond. And that's what drove us to go down. Can that take me about where you left off?
Dave, do you have anything to add?
Sure.
Well, you know now that we went, and I think most of you at least have a rough idea what happened there. I just want to tell you why I went. I am just a citizen. That is, I don't have political aspirations. I'm a person who cares. And I also hate confrontation. I do not like getting in people's faces. It makes me all jumpy, and I get all twitchy and really handle it. However, I came to realize that the way this was going, if people didn't do something, that they were probably going to kill those people. And that was more important than me getting pushy. As citizens, my friends, it's our responsibility to watch the federal government and to say no when it's time to say no. Otherwise, we're on the fast track to becoming slaves.
Who's the law enforcement for government?
Congress.
We are. Congress through us. And we have failed on the congressional front, on the law enforcement front, because if you have a Congress that won't stand up to a lawless president, that won't stand up to lawless actions from agencies within the federal government, what you have is a fry cook who's burning the chow. And when you have a fry cook that burns the chow over and over and over again, you fire them and you replace them with someone who knows how to cook fries. Because that's what the Congress is. They are simply our delegates. They are the extension of our self-governing authority that we established in America. What we're seeing is a consistent failing of we the people to exercise our self-governance and to make sure that the law is followed. So, when we got down on the ground, Anthony and Josh and some others from Washington that got there first were just kind of coordinating and helping out. And when Nathan and I showed up, we had the communications trailer, we had some resources we brought with us, we had internet and things like that so we could get images and content out. And one of the things we found out very quickly is that the information going out from the Bundy Ranch was extremely inaccurate. And we were making Facebook posts and not really going over the top with media, but just saying, hey, here's what's happening down here. And I remember times when we were sitting in the trailer and we were getting calls from state legislators saying, we hear it's going down, what's happening? And the crickets are chirping and we're sitting there having fried chicken and saying, no, nothing's going down. We have an age of communication like we've never had in history, and yet our communication seems to be at an all-time low.
And an age of information, not communication.
Indeed.
It's both, though, really. I mean, we have the tools to communicate and put information out, and I might argue that it's more of an age of communication because we have the tools to communicate, but not a whole lot of information coming out of it that's accurate. But I understood. So, Anthony, do you want to take it a little bit and just give a little bit of an overview, because you were actually there for longer than many of us were, and just give kind of the 5-minute overview of what we saw there that week.
As I said before, my mission, if you will, when I arrived on the site, was to gather information, to figure out what was going on, who was who, what groups were involved, and how it was being played out. So I spent the first day and a half just staying quiet and watching. Just watching all the different little groups, watching who was being the tough guy, who was actually leading, but leading from the shadows. And I just gathered all that information. And then I applied it to a picture and tried to decipher what was happening. When I come up to my personal conclusion, what was happening, I reported back to the state legislators what I felt was happening, what I felt could go wrong, what was going right, and if I felt that they should respond immediately or they had a couple days. When I first arrived, with all due honesty, we had, well, let's cover the meaning of militia first, because it's very important. The definition of militia. Can anybody tell me what the true definition of a militia is?
Armed citizens.
Yes, very close. It's any body of any group of able-bodied citizens that are willing to stand and defend their community. That's the true meaning of a militia. So using that definition of militia, there was a large militia gathering down there. I will tell you, this militia had people walking with walkers. This militia had people, a single mother show up with a .22 pistol. Never fired a day in her life. But she knew freedom was worth defending. We had organized militia show up without commanders. We had commanders from organized militia show up without a militia. But we had a lot of people thinking that they were in charge. And for the first couple of days, it was going to go down. It was going to go down all right. But the problem was, it was going to go down in our own militia camp. But with God's grace, everybody stayed calm, and they worked through those bumps. Within the first couple of days, we sent a lot of whack jobs back. Go home. And they started developing a camaraderie. There were still several large groups that wanted to be in charge, but it was civil now. The Bundys by that time had established their own security force. Some fairly well-trained guys. They were doing a good job. In this time, we're still having small interactions with the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management. Very important to remember that, Bureau of Land Management. Not a SWAT team, not a standing army, not a military force. They're a land management organization. Our first night that we arrived, we fell in with Councilwoman Michelle Fier, excuse me if I say her last name wrong, that's the best I can do. We fell in with her and her team. And we were responding to 3 protesters that had been arrested or detained and taken to a government installation. Excuse me, let me retract that. A military installation. My warning to her was, is it really a military installation, or is it a government installation, or is it a land management installation? Because it's very important. All 3 of those require a different response from the citizens. It turned out to be, yes, a Bureau of Land Management compound. She approached the compound, showed her credentials. They treated her like a high school kid, told her to go away. Within 5 minutes of her leaving, they called her back. They somehow got her personal private cell number within 5 minutes when she called. My advice to her was, do not return. They want your cameras. They want the evidence you got while you were there, which she did not. In returning to the Bundy Ranch area, we got stopped by some other citizens, and they professed that there was a kidnapping by the BLM where they stopped, grabbed a couple guys, threw them in a vehicle, took them down the road a couple miles, kicked the crap out of them, threw them out and drove off. There was a local news media coverage of that. We seen that gentleman very quickly. He was battered up a little bit. We personally did not get to interview him. Somewhere out there's claimed that it was filmed, that the beating was filmed. We have not personally found that yet. From that point, we returned to the Bundy area. Keep in mind, the area where you see the protesters is 2 miles outside the ranch. And it's on state highway. And there's some parking areas and pull-out areas to the side.
Just like we're seeing back behind here.
Correct.
And we'll have some wider.
The land behind it is Bureau of Land Managed land. And on the other side of this area is that Bureau of Land Managed land. From that point, once we got back there,
Somewhere around there is somewhere around this week. Setting up that Friday afternoon.
I'm just trying to stop where you get there too, so I'm trying to take over there. But the point I'm making is that we had citizens, militiamen, patriots, respond from Illinois, North Dakota, Massachusetts, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Washington, California. We had a family come down before we left from northern Quebec, Canada. And just to tell their American brethren, stand your ground. We agree with you. I need to also emphasize the difference of the people that were there is just as different as what they were here. I bet you there was men there in their 90s walking with walkers. There was young children there. There was young women, older women. There was guys pulling guard duty of the Bundys that were in their 90s, and it was dropping down to freezing at night. And they're sitting up there in the Cypress Hill pulling their guard watch. And you couldn't drag them off the hill. They were going to pull their part. I'm going to leave it there and turn it back over to Gavin and let him catch up to that point.
Thank you, Anthony. Awesome. You know, we don't need to go through a specific play-by-play of everything, but Anthony gave you a good build-up of kind of what was happening there on the ground. And here's the bottom line. The portrayal of this as this is a lawful government organization enforcing the law is the most incorrect thing that you could possibly take away from this. The law is what's defined in this Constitution by we the people. Sometimes what's defined on our local levels, in our states, in our counties, but never outside the boundaries of this Constitution. Here's the supreme law of the land. And we have a fault on various levels. First of all, the BLM, if we want to go back to the very beginning from a constitutional perspective under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Number one, the BLM has no right to exist constitutionally. Now, I realize we're in a situation where they do exist. It's absolutely true. The BLM under the Constitution... Absolutely not. Would you like a copy?
I have.
Okay, you should read Article 1, Section 8, because Article 1, Section 8 says these are the enumerated powers of the federal government. So it says, here's what the federal government can do. And then further, in the 10th Amendment, and let's read the 10th real quick, just to clarify. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What this means is that anything not granted to the federal government in the Constitution is not only not the federal government's job, it is not within their power to carry it out. Now, this is not a debatable matter. It's the law of the Constitution, and that's why the Constitution is so simple and elegant. But let's step away from that for a moment. Let's say you're okay with the fact that the BLM exists. Now, I realize they've existed for a long time, and there are a lot of things in federal government that are outside the boundaries of the Constitution that we the people have tolerated, and that was a mistake. But up till now, I think most of us kind of thought of the BLM as a fairly benign management organization. And if you take an agency like the BLM, and you put them in a position where suddenly they are law enforcement, they are enforcing at the point of a gun, they are rustling cattle, they are arresting people without authority. What you have in this situation is the BLM impersonating officers, because the BLM are not officers, and I've taken this directly from sheriffs that are sitting sheriffs saying, if we had the BLM carrying out these actions within our county, we would remove them for impersonating officers, because the sheriff in this county is who had authority. So let's say the BLM went to the sheriff, and they said, we have this situation and we want you to get involved. Well, the sheriff has the authority to determine whether or not to get involved in this situation if it falls within the law, not the BLM. What we have in the Bundy Ranch situation is a cowardly sheriff who wouldn't do his job and wouldn't take a side and determine what needed to happen. Now, the BLM was unconstitutional in that the federal government is not granted to manage all these lands. They're not granted to manage this Bureau of Land Management, BLM land. They're not granted to manage national forests. This is not within the boundaries of the Constitution. I realize it's where we're at. What we need to start thinking about as states is we need to start returning our lands to the states, to the counties. So in the larger sense, we'll get to questions in just a moment.
Which is true. Why don't you do it in a lawful manner?
That's exactly what we're going to come to.
Why this, though? Why did it come to this?
This was, yeah, absolutely.
Why it come to this is simple of one reason, and one reason only. Because the Las Vegas metro area, which, by the way, is the 7th largest law enforcement agency in the United States, that metro area has 16,400 deputy sheriffs, 400 reserve officers. They're the 7th largest law enforcement agency in the United States. That's including the FBI, ATF, all of them. Why we got to this here is because the sheriff of that metro area was nothing but a coward. He did not stand up for his oath. He did not stand up for his oath and put a stop to bureaucratic terrorism. The federal government, this entity, the BLM, was terrorizing the people. That's why we got here. If he had done his job, it would have stopped way before it ever happened. Plain and simple, job done. He should have done his job, and then the people wouldn't have had to rise up and do it for him. That was why we got there.
Amen.
Absolutely. And we're going to continue with questions in a few minutes. Sir, we're going to continue with questions soon.
You're ready to shoot those officers?
Let me ask you something.
They were pointing guns at
If someone breaks...
Were you
Hold on.
prepared to shoot those
If we're going to do a question dance,
Were you ready to do it?
there was no officers there. There was illegal federal agents. These were not officers.
You were gonna
Do you know who the officers of the law in that situation were? It was the people.
You're gonna
So
shoot
they are the lawfully
The sheriff
and
department
dutifully...
was there?
The sheriff department was not there. That was the problem. This was the issue, is the sheriff department...
It was federal land, wasn't it?
No. don't want to believe it. Come on.
What's your name? What's your name?
The federal land does
What's your
not
name?
belong to the government, but to the...
You're Carrie? Okay, and what's this gentleman's name?
My name is Dave.
And are you from around here, Eddie?
Yes, I am. I'm in a district that you're running.
Let me ask you this. Let's say the government comes and they say that you owe them a bill, and they come with sniper rifles pointed at your children. They break down your door. We saw that. Okay, we're not going to play games with facts. We're dealing with facts here.
So you guys are pointing right.
Actually, we went there as peacekeepers, and it's important to put that down.
I was there. I was on the freeway when I see
That's absolutely
BLM
true.
on the left and all the citizens on the right. Not one of those citizens
Okay.
had their guns pointed, but every single one of them
Here's the
BLM
thing.
officers had their guns pointed at those citizens. They
Okay,
were guns.
okay, let's come down.
Guys, we're going to have order. We're going to have questions. I'm going to ask you guys just to wait, and we will take questions. But let's do it in an orderly fashion. We don't all have to agree here. This is an information discussion, and let's do it cordially. You can walk out of here and you can disagree, and we can all go home and we can study and read our constitutions and learn. We don't have to get all worked up about it. That's why we're here, is to talk about this. The beauty of this whole situation is that people took a stand, and they did it peacefully. Blood was not spilled, and God's grace intervened here, and I absolutely give credit there. That's what happened.
Amen.
But what we want to address is the core values of the law that we placed on government. So, to pick up a little bit where Anthony left off, that Saturday morning, there was things going on. We settled the trailer down. We were not really sure how long we were going to have to be there. And we were just going to start coordinating with other people, helping out as much as possible, getting information out. What happened that day is the sheriff came to speak around 9 or 10 a.m. And the sheriff, it's important to note here, the sheriff had not had a presence here. The sheriff was ignoring the situation, and he didn't want to get involved. He was letting the BLM come in there and do what they wanted up to this point. So the BLM had pulled back a little bit because they were rounding up cows in another area. And then this morning, the sheriff came in, and he got up on the podium, and Clive and Bundy was up there, and he said, the BLM is going to back off. Mr. Bundy got up, and he gave the BLM an ultimatum. He said they had to remove all their things, they had to come and lay down their arms that they had, that they should not have been in there with, that they did not have the legal authority to be in there with, and that they had 1 hour to do that. Now, those of us that were there, Anthony and Nathan and I and some of us others, we were concerned as this started to go down because, let's be honest, there were some hotheads there. There were some people that did want to start a fight. And there was some of that youthful energy and people that are tired of government and they wanted to do something about it. And it's important as patriots that we maintain that moral high ground, just like the framers did. They were considered radicals too, but when we came into the American Revolution, we had a foundation of principle and God-given liberty. And that's what defined America. That's what made us unique. Now, all these people rode out there, and we were dealing with a situation where we had information coming down suggesting that the federal government was about to escalate very severely. They were sending in reinforcements, and at one point, and I'll have Anthony fill you in on some intel we got, but at one point we had intel coming down, and Anthony actually went out and confirmed that. And you just want to tell him real quick, just the guy on the hill. What's that?
That would be what that was.
Okay.
Gavin said the framers were considered radicals. That's true, but it went far beyond that. The framers were traitors. To the British Crown, they were traitors. If those men, you know the names of Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, had been caught, they would have been tied to a pole with their hands over their head, they would have slit a hole in their belly, tore their guts out, and burned them in front of them as they died. They were not radicals in the eyes of the British. They were enemy combatants and traitors. The government never looks at those who question it as reasonable, no matter how reasonable we may be.
Yes. And Anthony, do you want to fill in just a little bit on, as we were there on Saturday, there was information coming down, people were riding up. So after this press conference, we see on the hill behind us here, which is kind of behind our trailer, there was people with horses. They had planted the flag on the hill. And basically what was happening is they were going to ride out to get the cattle that the BLM were supposed to be releasing.
This picture that's shown here is actually in the opposite direction of what I'm going to be talking about. But I want to bring your attention to something. See the two little knolls? You'll see the flags over on the one over here, and then the one individual flag over on this right here. Does those knolls look familiar to you? You know what? Does those knolls look familiar to any of you? When we first got reports of snipers, and then there was the joke amongst us that are trained that they weren't snipers, they were sharpshooters because they weren't hidden. They were actually silhouetted to give their position away. Why would a sniper give his position away to the enemy? Intimidation. And intimidation only. That was the reason of it. Women and children down on the road just below this, about 400 feet below this. Top of those two knolls are high silhouetted snipers, sharpshooters, for the purpose of only intimidating the masses. It was their only purpose there. On the day of the event, about 500 feet on the other side of this picture was our camp, the command center, if you will, the Bundy Command Center. 1,000 yards out on a knoll, we got intel that the government forces were moving in. So I picked up a pair of binoculars and remembered my military training as a scout 20 years ago, and I went looking. We knew they were coming, but we just didn't know what was coming. 1,000 yards out, I spotted two sniper nests. Well hidden, they were real snipers. Guess what was behind me? Men, women, and children, with two sniper nests dug in, pointing at that crowd. And they weren't sharpshooters, they were snipers. They were well hidden.
Yes, and it's important, it's hard to emphasize the gravity of the situation here. We thought people were going to die. The government had every appearance of escalating this situation, and you guys need to understand that the Second American Revolution almost started here. Hundreds of people were willing to die for your liberty. And whether you agree with everything that happened there or not is not really the point so much as understanding that these patriots were willing to stand up for your right to come here and say you disagree or that you agree, and to go out and to interact with people and have these conversations. That's what our liberty and our Constitution gives us. So as all these people wrote out, and we had concerns that there was going to be hot-headedness, that they were going to go up there and try and pick a fight, because they were fighting out, and many of them were armed, and they were ready to defend themselves if need be. But if you review the videos of what actually happened when they got up there, Eamon Bundy and the people that were in charge actually held back the crowd really well. And they didn't allow them just to rush up there and say, let's pick a fight. I genuinely believe, and you guys tell me if you have any difference on this, but I think that what the federal government was hoping for is that we would fire the first shot.
Let me add one thing right there. Show of hands, just for a quick reference. How many of you have ever served in combat? When you were on the front line in combat, what would have been your instinct if somebody fired a firecracker or a bottle rocket over your front line? We had the federal government at an armed military or militia front line defending the Bundys, firing firecrackers and bottle rockets in the middle of the night over the front line. They were trying to prompt a fight. They were trying to pick a fight. All they wanted is one hothead, one young kid that didn't have restraint to fire one round, and those people would have been slaughtered. That's a fact.
The federal government was there not as protectors, not as law enforcement, but as antagonists. When the people of a self-governing nation have a government that is lawless, it doesn't matter what badge a government official wears. The law and the law enforcement duty falls to every single one of us to protect our families and our wives and our children and our sisters and our neighbors. That is our job. This idea that we must be patriotic to the state itself rather than to the liberty and the values that we hold dear is a lie. The state is not our master, we are its master. So what happened when all these hundreds of people rode out, and we see these images where they were standing out there against the federal government, who had their assault weapons and their snipers. And the biased media likes to play this as, look, we have these radicals that are trying to start a fight with government. Now, if you look back here, this is a mass grave that the BLM dug, and they were burying cattle in it. Because they were supposed to be rounding up these cattle. They didn't have any authority, even from the court orders they were using, to slaughter the cattle. They were gathering these cattle. And there's a few images here that are a little bit repulsive, nothing too terrible, but what we had was the BLM rounding up and killing these cattle and burying them, not all of them, but many of them, in these pits.
Criminal.
It's criminal. That's what it's called. If you go somewhere without proper jurisdiction, without due process, our Constitution absolutely guarantees that we have the right to our life, our liberty, our property, and our due process. And I don't care what badge you wear. Do you want the federal government able to show up at your doorstep and kill your animals, assault your family, and abuse the law in the name of protecting you? Is that protection?
No.
Then why on earth would the American people tolerate such an egregious display of lawlessness from the federal government? And the answer is they didn't. What happened here was historic. It was a pivotal moment in our history of Americans finally stepping up and saying, we're not going to allow you to cross this line. We had agents sicking dogs on women and people that were doing nothing, people that were standing there protesting the situation. If you stopped and engaged with a BLM agent and just talked to them, they would said hello. They would put you in handcuffs. They would take your camera. There was no semblance of law and order. These were thugs, and they were acting as such.
Let me explain that picture a little bit. I think I can talk a lot enough from there. What we have here is we have Eamon Bundy's sister, right here. She's engaging in a conversation, mind you, with, excuse me, wait for it, Special Agent David P. Love. When did the BLM get special agents? What did I say, David?
Yeah.
I'll correct you. Daniel P. Love. Right here. Special agent. Bureau of Land Management has special agents. Notice the combat gear. This isn't a cop. This isn't a land management. He's got combat gear. And it gets worse. Shortly after this right here, the reason why this young lady here in blue come into this picture is these gentlemen right here.
Mind you.
Excuse me?
And she's pregnant, mind you.
Yes, and she's pregnant. They threw her to the ground. They body slammed her. Picked her up and body slammed her to the ground. This young lady right here. What she come in the picture for is because her brother, Eamon, which is a great guy, mind you, was having a discussion with Special Agent Daniel P. Love, I'm sorry, and they tased him, not once, but twice. And then while he was still going through fidgets on the ground, they sicked the dogs on him. In self-defense, he starts kicking the dogs, and they continue to tase him. She stepped in to save her brother's life. Mind you, this isn't on BLM-managed land. This is on a public roadway. They're not even legally where they should be managing. This is a public roadway this happens. And this is just the start.
It just goes on and on and
May I
on.
add something to that?
Yes.
In their assault on, I don't know her first name, I'm sorry, Miss Bundy and her brother Eamon, there was neither them or the various other people there who were, in fact, mostly armed, that is, carrying, legally. No one drew their guns. The self-control that was displayed there, when they were assaulted by violent men, no one drew their guns or attacked back except Eamon kicked the dog to push it off him. That was the most violence we saw from the Bundy team down there.
It's popular to play this up as a bunch of domestic terrorists. If what we saw at the Bundy Ranch is indeed a domestic terrorist, then every one of us should hope to fall within the confines of such a definition. Because that is people who are willing to stand up for the law. And it's been well established by the courts, that doing your job, following orders, is not an excuse to violate people's rights and to violate the law. And it doesn't matter what badge or what position you hold, you are accountable for your actions. And if we stand idly by while our friends and neighbors are assaulted by criminals, that will come back and it will affect us as well. Now I want to read something real quick from Article 1, Section 8. And Article 1 and the enumerated powers of the federal government are elegant because it's so simple. It doesn't go into big, deep, long legal things like we do today. It just says, hey, here's what you can do, guys. To exercise legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square, as made by session of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of government of the United States, to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. This is the enumeration of power for the federal government to own and manage land. Now, owning 80% of a state, ruling it with an iron fist, taking so-called public land and treating it and the people on it like they're within your serfdom, and punishing them when they step outside the boundaries of the king's law or hunt the king's deer, that's not law under our Constitution. That is tyranny.
Here's a very important quote. Very important quote. We wish you guys could stay and actually engage with it. Okay, I hope. Have a safe trip back to Seattle. Guys, drive safe. A very important quote by a man that some of you might know, or know of. I wish I had met him. On every question of the on every question of the construction of the Constitution, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or inverted against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. Thomas Jefferson. What he's saying here is if at any time the Constitution is questioned, not to judge it by our times, but to judge it by the times it was written, because that was the intent. The Constitution is not a living, breathing document. It stays the same. So he's telling us to return to that time and judge it by the people of that time, because that was the intent that was intended to follow us forward.
Absolutely. Folks, of all the tyranny in history and all the people that have died to preserve it, there's nothing so disheartening to preserve liberty, I'm sorry.
Folks have died for both, I'm afraid.
And all the people that have died to preserve liberty, there's nothing so disheartening as a people who, having once gained liberty, are too lazy and apathetic to preserve it. And that's what we've come to, I think, in our generation. And I'm not blaming any one person, I'm looking at all of us. And I'm saying we're accountable. And we still, as we saw at the Bundy Ranch, are in a situation where we still have our arms. We still have the force of constitutional law behind us. We still wield authority. But we have to be willing to stand together and have the courage to stand up and say no. I'm rather fond of the Federalist Papers. And one of my favorites is Federalist 78. And in it, I'm paraphrasing a little because it's rather old Englishy, but in Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton is addressing the superiority of the U.S. Constitution and why it's critical. And he's addressing what the legislature can do and what the judges can do. And he says, all law that violates the Constitution is void. And this is a profound statement that every single one of us needs to have ready on our lips, because I don't care if it's your local city council or your county or your state for your federal government. We have a lot of different levels of power, and the elegance of that is quite remarkable. And there's local authority and state authority, but when it comes down to these fundamental rights of certain things the government can and cannot do, of the rights not granted to us by the Constitution, but that we own inherently and affirm upon the government through the Constitution, which is the law we placed on them. If a law is made contrary to this law, it is not law. Not for a moment. They can vote on it 1,000 times. It is not law, and it is the responsibility of we the people to stamp it out and throw it in the trash. Because it is not law, it is criminal, it is lawlessness, and at that point, we the people become the enforcers and the protectors of law. Nathan, do you have anything to add, and then we'll take some questions? I think we've kind of covered the general
I have one thing
overview.
to add. You know, there is a way tyrants can make it law in a way we really can't argue with. There's a process to amend that Constitution. There's a few in there now that I think are really bad ideas. Most of you probably know them. I'm not going to go into that now, but they can still do that. And the fact that they have done it very little means they're still afraid. They haven't won yet, guys. This isn't over. There's still a stand to be made.
Absolutely, and this is an ongoing stand. There's actually people still showing up at the ranch. There's people still serving watches there, and we encourage anybody that wants to get involved. I mean, first of all, I want to acknowledge the people that were supporting from home, because just because you weren't there, when it was going down on Saturday, it's really impossible for me to describe how much we thought that a lot of people were about to die. We weren't sure if we were driving home or coming home in boxes. There was a serious escalation
I was
happening.
thinking boxes.
We were thinking that for a while. And
Our actual discussion, if you will, was how we were going to all of a sudden get enough medical supplies in there to respond. I had brought my combat lifesavers bag, but that wasn't going to help with a group that size. We were actually just sitting there discussing how do we get enough medical supplies from 1,000 miles away to us fast enough when it was happening now.
it was coming down. And I remember standing in the trailer, and unlike some of the other people that were in that trailer and that were on the conference phones, I have not been in the military. I've not been in combat. And it was very surreal as we sat there and talked about how many people were going to die and how quickly. And I remember pulling my first aid kit out from under the trailer, covered in the camper. And we travel a lot, and I like to think of myself as pretty well prepared. And I remember thinking how completely inadequate those bandages were. And I'm a bit of an amateur herbalist, and I like to study first aid and things a little. And I thought, I know nothing about what's about to happen here and how we're going to deal with it. And it was really astounding and very humbling. And I want to give credit to the people that were supporting from home with prayer, because I think I'm confident the reason that this did not turn to blood is that God intervened. Because what ultimately happened down there on the front is not, despite the fact that some of the celebratory and energetic young militia guys like to think, those BLM guys, they knew they were going to get slaughtered, is what a few guys were telling us. And I just shook my head, because we weren't prepared for anything in terms of a real battle. That's not what we had gone there for. People were willing to defend themselves, but it would have been a slaughter if the BLM. There was reinforcement coming in. No, it was not the BLM. And God intervened, and there's a lot to be learned from what happened there. And the stand just doesn't diminish from anybody's courageous stand, but we were not going to go into glorious revolution and take back the republic at the Bundy Ranch. If it went to violence, we were simply going to die, and that would have been the history.
Well, and people knew that, too.
Yeah, and most people really understood that.
That they were going to just be the first battle of a larger battle to come. They knew that they were going to be the cannon fire.
Yeah.
They knew that. And man, woman, child, young and old were willing to stand that line and take that. Because they knew that that's what they had to do. Whoa.
Were the BLMers contract employees like Blackwater? I mean, were they paramilitary?
Let me speak from my experience. My opinion, this is all this is, my opinion, my experience. I work with contractors in Iraq. I have friends that are contractors. When we dealt with BLM down there, you had BLM agents that carried themselves, acted like law enforcement officers. They reminded you of another, just a peace officer, with the way they carried themselves, the way they spoke. There was a large contingency of 250 plus that anybody that's been around contractors in large groups know how they stand out by the way they act. Not saying they act badly, I'm just saying that there's a definite difference between them and law enforcement. They act differently. They carry themselves differently. They dress differently. There was definitely a large contingency down there that acted just like contractors. Yes.
Military.
That is my opinion, and that's my observation from experience. Is that fact? I can't say it's fact. But I will tell you it was my opinion and my observation.
They didn't look like range cattle managers.
No. They didn't even act like it. They didn't even move like it. Well, let's drop back to that one picture of the Rangers. Yes. Right here. Can I talk this through to you guys? This is an extension of a management organization. Anybody know what that maneuver is called? I know you do.
Part of a violent advance.
Correct. It is part of that that movement. But that formation right there is called stacking. We used that very same formation in Iraq when we were getting ready to go into a tight alley. We used that same formation when we got ready to breach a door. And what happens when you go through a door? This guy breaches. This guy behind him, he goes in and he turns right. The guy behind him goes in and turns left. The fourth guy goes straight in, and they have ultimate trust for each other. Because this guy here is probably going to get shot. But that doesn't stop this guy. He goes in anyway. And the reason why is because he knows this guy's life counts on it. This is a military-trained tactic. A lot of the military trained this to the SWAT teams. This is a military maneuver done by management agents. This isn't Forest Service. This isn't BLM. This is a military attire. Yes, it's not according to what a lot of the military wear. You've got some operators that dress this way. You've got some operators that dress a little differently. But this is a military force right here. And I'll tell you right now, it was an illegal military force.
Absolutely.
What's the Ranger track? What's the Ranger?
BLM Ranger.
Huh?
BLM, Bureau of Land Management Ranger.
Let me
They're
ask
Park
you
Ranger.
something.
Park
Yeah,
Ranger.
These are, I don't know if everyone here has seen Yogi Bear, but this is not Mr. Ranger that we see here. This is not a lawful and orderly thing. Now, we come to this idea of, the very idea of the BLM as an overstep of the Constitution. And yes, we've allowed that to happen for a long time. We see, and we're seeing this in our time, that the government's natural state is to grow into tyranny. And we've had this outlook for so many years of, well, it's an overstep, but what's really the big deal? We need this taken care of. There is a means in the Constitution to properly and legally amend it so that we can grant the federal government other limited authorities. We have to start understanding how important it is that we start pulling back and reining in the federal government under those authorities. Let's go and open it up if people have questions. I see our other friends left, so we'll open it up to other questions.
I would like to do one thing before we do.
Okay.
I would like to thank my wife, and my friend Paul, and all those others that are here and that are not here that jumped in at the last moment to make this happen for us. My wife, because like I said, I had planned going for 3 days, and it was just to gather information and come back. I was asked by the state to stay longer for their eyes and ears on the ground. I was unprepared for that, to stay that long. My wife and my friend Paul loaded up gear, our camp trailer, our vehicle, and gathered up supplies, and they drove a 1,400-mile round trip in 2 days to bring the people on the ground supplies, water, food, sleeping gear, everything.
400 miles.
Yeah, 2,400 miles.
What did I say, 1,400? Yeah. No, I apologize. For me, it was actually 1,168 miles one way. That was what the mileage was for me.
Yeah, it's really important to acknowledge our wives who are back home and people back home supporting, and this is something that we should have never had to see in America. And it's something that we have the opportunity now, and I always say we can still stick our necks out without them being chopped off. Now, we were thinking we were getting pretty close to the chopping off point down there at the Bundy Ranch, but we can still take a stand and stick our necks out, and it is our duty to do so, because if we do not stand now for liberty, our children and our grandchildren will have to buy it back at the price of blood. That's a certainty. Josh, do you have anything you'd like to add on this? Okay. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
What?
I never understood the reason, one of the reasons I'm here. I've never been able to understand from the media. These guys just didn't pick to have a confrontation there. How come, what caused this in the first place? Bundy's refusal to pay BLM fees? I don't get it. And I've read too, $1 million. My God, BLM's like $1.37 a month per animal unit a month or something. It's nothing. How can you rack up $1 million in
$200 a day fines per animal.
What's that?
They said the government fined him $200 per day per animal.
Well, yeah, after he's been out there, 40 years?
Yeah.
To understand what was going on, we got to understand the purpose of the BLM. What was it designed to do? I'm here to tell you that the original purpose of the BLM was nothing more than a cattlemen's union between the cattlemen and the federal government. That's all it was. And they called it a bureau. The cattlemen had to put up fencing. They had to manage that fencing. They had to cut roads and maintain roads across state land, federal land, however you want to look at it. So what they did is they come together for the management of land purpose, and they decided they would pay this new bureau a fee per head of cattle. And for that fee, that bureau would manage those roads, manage those fences, manage those waterways, and monitor overgrazing on that land. It was a mutual agreement. 20 years ago, what ended up happening, there was 53 cattle ranchers within that area, the Gulf View area. The BLM quit managing the road, they quit managing the fences, and they started using those fees to buy off the other cattle ranchers or fight them in court and take their land from them.
Buy them off.
I'll give you money, you sell me your ranch back to the government. That's what the BLM started doing 20 years ago. Clyde and Bundy stepped forward and said, I agreed to pay these fees to you to manage roads, manage fences, and manage the land from overgrazing. If you are not going to do that, and you're going to use my money against me, I no longer will give it to you. What I will do is I will offer it to the county that I live in. Because now they're managing the roads. So I will give my money to them because they will do the job. The county felt that they weren't legally entitled to do so, so the county refused the money. But Clive and Bundy said, I will not give this money that was agreed upon to fix roads and fences and manage land for you to come after me legally to take my land from me because you want it. Out of 53 cattle farmers down there, there's one left, Clive and Bundy. They have run off all the others or bought them off of that land.
And they also want to drop the number of cattle, he can run down to 150.
Yeah. Can't run a farm on that.
What's he running now? I have no idea.
Close to 1,000. Close to 1,000.
I spoke to a family friend of the Bundys about how many cattle he was running. I had assumed when I went down there that he was a big operation and that was just a small portion of his cattle. That was not factual. The cattle they were rounding up were all of Mr. Bundy's cattle. And Anthony is correct, it was between 500 and 1,000 head. It's calving season, so it's going up, and they don't know the exact count.
Well, did they have a judgment against him?
I'm not sure.
There were some court judgments, yeah, basically saying that the BLM can go out there and round up these cattle.
So this confrontation was related to the roundup of those cattle.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's ultimately what it came down to, is they were rounding up the cattle, they were preparing to remove them from out of state. And it's also important to note, people say, well, you guys were just trying to stop the due process of law. There was, at this point, there was state legislators involved. There was a lot of concern on a high level because basically what was about to go down was cattle rustling. I mean, there are laws in the state of Nevada that I won't pretend to be an expert on, but you cannot just load up somebody's cattle and haul them off. So it was one thing to round up the cattle, it was another thing to transport them across state lines.
I cannot speak to all the laws regarding range. I do know that the BLM planned to sell those cattle in Utah. The state of Utah contacted the BLM and said you cannot sell those cattle in Utah. They said that's fine, we'll go through Utah and sell them in Idaho. The Utah government said no, you fellows don't understand. You will not bring that man's cattle through Utah.
Why did they just sell them in Nevada then?
I think no one would have bought them. And you can estimate the value of the cattle they killed, which they had no court or anybody that going to do, at several hundreds of thousands of dollars. They shot a bull. You're right. They shot a bull. At least one of the bulls was shot.
And a cow-calf terrace first was at least $2,200 to $3,000.
Yeah, and at least one of the bulls that was shot, he was on top of the hill, and the bullet was in the top of his head. I don't know if any of you have ever slaughtered cattle. I have. They're quite tall. To shoot a cow on the top of the head, you need a ladder or a helicopter. There was no ladder out there.
In every front that you examine this, it was lawless. Now, it's interesting to get into the land rights side because the Bundys have been there for a long time, and we're not going to try and get into that today other than to say that it's not as simple as the BLM coming in and saying, hey, we own the land rights now. The Bundys were there long before the BLM. There's legal issues with the land rights and them being there first, them having purchased some of the land rights. The BLM was so far out of their authority on every front that it was astounding. But more importantly, it wasn't simply about the cattle. What's happening is the federal government is waging war on rural America.
The point we need to remember here, and this is the most important thing about this, the point we need to remember here, regardless of the sin or the crime committed by the Bundys, this was not about them. This was about the government overreach and intrusion upon our rights. If they violate his rights, they violate our rights because we share one thing in common, the Constitution. It's our Constitution they're violating. We need to remember that regardless of what he did or didn't do, does not grant the government the authority to violate the law. They need to understand they need to comply with the law. It's not my job as a citizen to force Bundy to comply with the law. It is my job as a citizen, as a patriot, to force the government to comply. And it's just as if it's your job.
We shouldn't be surprised at the government's actions in this. You know, we've had the end of the First World War. There were veterans that were demanding some back pay. The government shot them down. One of the White House lawn. You jump forward to Ruby Ridge. They send two guys out from Baltimore, Maryland, with guns. They killed a 14-year-old kid and his dog.
And his mother watched this whole video.
Then they sent a sniper out there. He hid behind a tree. And when Vicki Weaver came to the door, holding the baby, put a bullet right between her eyes.
And
None of those people had ever been in a court of law. No judge jury ever found them guilty. Cold-blooded, first-degree murder. Premeditated murder.
Exactly. And it was premeditated to the point when the special agent in charge of the FBI unit on the ground, when he was in flight from D.C. to Idaho, he opened the file and he made the determination that Vicki Weaver was the backbone of the family, and he gave the order, kill on sight, kill her, the family will crumble. And the moment she stepped out that door with that baby in her hand, they went through with that order. It was premeditated murder before the special agent was even on the ground.
And then we had Waco, 80 men, women, and children.
And a lot of these people that were there brought these things up. They said, I'm here because I don't want another Ruby Ranch. I don't want another Waco. And they were there standing so that that didn't happen again, so that there was a solidarity of people standing against that. Because I think that's probably what would have happened had people not showed up to support them.
I know folks who were friends with Mrs. Weaver, and I know that I could see the similarity in what was ramping up at the Bundys to what they had told me firsthand ramped up in North Idaho.
And let's step back a little bit, take that bigger picture. Let's consider solutions. One of the things we saw on the outset of this was the forming of the Coalition of Western States, which we sat in on that board meeting and were involved working with that. But you've got legislators from all these different states. You've got speakers. Is it around 20 legislators involved now?
It's actually pushing closer to 40.
Is it pushing closer to 40? So this is not just a group of people saying, hey, we got to get together and stand up for liberty. It is that, but it's also beyond that. You are having representatives who are willing to stand up. You've got representatives like Michelle Fior who are spending time out on that ranch, putting themselves in the line of fire and saying, if you want to come back, you're going to have to come through me. And this comes down not only to us as individuals standing up when things get bad, it also comes to our everyday actions of holding our elected officials accountable. Because if you imagine this situation, you wouldn't have had this situation had you had a sheriff that did their job. And had you had a people who did their job, you would not have a sheriff who would ignore the Constitution. So every one of us in our counties, our state legislators, our sheriffs, and I know you guys got a sheriff election coming up here in Yakima. This is one of the reasons I decided to run for Congress in the 4th District. We have all these different seats and positions at various different levels. And it's the responsibility of the people. We can stand around and we can throw popcorn at the TV all we want. But unless we get involved and do something about it, it's actually our fault. And the problem with America is not Congress. They should be accountable for their actions, for sure. But the problem with America is we the people. And that's who's accountable to change this. Do we have any other questions? Absolutely.
She's correct, all doesn't even have to be in office. I am not in office. I'm not currently running for any office. You still have a duty, my friends.
Yeah, we can all take part of that.
And it can also start with, most importantly, in my belief, most importantly, with your children. Teach your children. Teach your children the Constitution. Teach them. So when they grow into adults, they'll have an understanding of what their real rights are and what their real responsibility to the next generation is.
And here's an area that we've greatly failed. And I think my brothers and I had an advantage there because we were homeschooled and we didn't have to deal with a system that didn't teach us the Constitution. So we had a little bit more of that foundation, but we can all teach our children the Constitution. And a little story coming home, we were in Oregon. And those of you that know me know that I sometimes have little encounters with checkpoints and things like that. And we were at a rest stop, and there was a station there with the game management, and they were inspecting boats. There was no boats there at the time, but they had this station set up. And there was a sign saying boats had to pull in. So I was there, and I just couldn't resist, and I just walked over with my camera, and the young lady got out of the truck, and there was nobody there, and I just said, hey, what's happening here? And she said, well, we inspect these boats for invasive species. And I said, oh, so it's not required, though. And she said, oh, yeah, it's required. And I said, well, doesn't it concern you? And we were real cordial. There was nothing real intense here. But I said, doesn't it concern you that the Fourth Amendment doesn't allow a government agency to stop and detain somebody without due process. What happens if they don't stop? And she said, well, the state patrol can chase them down. And I said, well, that's not within the law of the Constitution. Did you swear an oath to the Constitution? She's like, well, I don't really know. And so I started realizing that this young woman was probably a grunt, and she really had no idea what was going on. And I talked to her about the Constitution, and her eyes were glazed over. And finally I said, let me explain this another way. How would you feel if the government told you what you could or couldn't speak? Or if they broke down your door in the middle of the night for no reason? And she looked at me and she said, I think I'd be fine with that.
Yes.
And I'm not kidding you. I'm not kidding. I have a video of this happening. And I don't know what to say at that point. I didn't really want to chastise her other than to say, you know, you really should learn the Constitution. And I went back to the truck and I gave her a copy, and she kind of looked at it like it was something that fell from space. Because here's a person who's involved in government, who was probably early 20s, and genuinely had no idea. Now that should break the heart of our generation that is raising children, because the reason the government can get away with the things that they've done, the reason we can have people sitting in a room like this and defending tyrannical despotism is because we have not instilled the values of liberty and the Constitution in America as well as we should have in our children. Yes.
I'd just say that there have always been 5% of the people that understood liberty and 95 didn't. It has nothing to do with this generation. When the Founding Fathers were trying to put their world together, it was 50, 60 people who understood liberty, and there were 1 million people against them. We don't want to pat ourselves on the back or go into a pity party. This is just how it is. People do not want to govern themselves.
It seems to be true that they don't. Most people I talk to seem to think that it's worse now than it has been, and I won't claim being alive in eras that I wasn't. So,
Do you have another question back there?
yes, go ahead.
In your guys' mind, you were there. What happened next? This isn't over. You want to?
Well, I've already been called a domestic terrorist, which could have a long-lasting effect on my children. They could go through the rest of their life being known as the children of the domestic terrorist.
Without a doubt.
Without a doubt. Because I've made my stand very clear. I'm not backing down. Where do we go from this? The founders of our country said, and I'm going to say this in my own words, but in their spirit, that each man must judge the Constitution by his own morality. It's up to you. It's up to you, each and individual one of you, to know where your line in the sand is and when you're going to make a stand and where you choose to die. The key of it is you choose where you're going to die. Die defending your children's freedom, or crawl in a ditch somewhere, curl up, and die eventually when they find you. Where this goes is going to be completely up to the hearts and minds of the people in this country. Because what's going to happen, few will stand, and few will die. That's going to happen eventually. It's going to be up to the rest of the people to look at those bodies and stand the next line behind them, and then the next line behind them, and the next line behind them. But where we go is up to you. We can't do it alone. The Bundys can't do it alone. The Patriots out there cannot do it alone. We need you. That's the best I can say. I mean, if you're asking me what I think the government's going to do, do you think the government's going to take this black guy and go lay down? No. None of us believe that. Did I answer your question? Or I don't want to leave you with the idea that I skirted your question.
Well, why don't we let's have Nathan kind of give that little wall up on that.
Well, we've already done something, that is, with the Coalition of Western States. That needs to get rolling. I am wholeheartedly behind a movement starting in Utah right now, and it is spreading, for the states to take back the land that is unlawfully claimed by the federal government. And don't pretend that they own it. If you want to make an argument for acts of Congress, like national parks and national wilderness, well, it's still unconstitutional, but at least they have an act of Congress. But BLM land, Federal Fish and Wildlife land, national forests, whatever other land, whatever other bureau you can come up with, they own it as much as, hey, you're my slave, I own you. That's how much they own it. They just say they do. And as far as what goes down next, we need to keep moving, we need to keep saying no, and we need to do it in places where we don't have to have guns being waved around at us. Because that's the hardest place to do it. I know, I did it. And the only way we're going to win this fight is if we have God behind us. So people like my wife Allie, like my family that were at home praying for us, let's all keep praying, that's important. And other than that, we'll see. Yes?
I guess I just thought somebody would talk about it, but is anybody going to talk about the comments that guy made this week? Picking cotton.
Oh, the picking cotton?
Yeah.
You know, I think the Bundys are best qualified to answer their own questions about their statements. And, yeah, he apologized for offending people, but I think the most important thing is to remember what really happened here.
I guess I'm not trying to get you to cover for it. I was just kind of asking, like, your reaction on what he said.
My reaction is Cliven Bundy's an old gentleman, and he says things that I wouldn't say, and I think he likes to talk and to ramble, and the media loves that because it gives them the opportunity to pick things out. And if you go and you listen to the context of what the man said, it's not what it's being made out to be. And to be honest, I'm ashamed of America this week. I am ashamed that in America we follow along with a forged label of racism that we place on people. I'm ashamed that we're in fear when that word comes out, when the liberals and the progressives try and demand that we attack someone. And I felt this week because I'm running for Congress. And you're not supposed to come out and go against anything regarding to race. Racism is not defined by a slip of the tongue. And I'm speaking of the dictionary definition. Racism is not about a word that comes out of your mouth. Racism is the intent of your heart and your soul, and it's thinking that you are better than someone else. And I don't know Cliven Bundy perfectly, but I don't see that from that man. So while I'm not going to speak to all his statements, and it's easy for me to say, sir, why did you word that way? But he's a lot older than me. He's from a different time and a different place. And you know what? If we are so petty in this nation that all we can focus on is that somebody used a word in a way that we're not used to using it, and we will try and turn them to mincemeat for that, then we're hopeless. And I think we need to focus and get beyond the pettiness that really comes directly from the people who hate liberty and who are trying to portray this entire endeavor as a group of domestic terrorists instead of a group of patriots standing up for liberty.
I'd just like to add to that in regards to what Cliven said. I do not think Cliven's a racist, at least not with that comment. I don't have any evidence that he is. You know what, though? It doesn't matter if Cliven Bundy is the most racist man on the face of this earth. The government still has no right to violate his rights. If Cliven Bundy, if 10 years down the road, he's not going to do this, but if he were to go out and say, let's enslave the black people, I would be duty-bound to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do that. What are you thinking? But it wouldn't change the fact that we are still duty-bound when his rights are violated in the state of the federal government. No, we're not going to do that. What are you thinking?
What we're ultimately talking about is the law, and what we really saw here was a diversion. The media was trying to label us domestic terrorists, And it wasn't really working because we were pointing back at people like Harry Reid and saying, there is a bureaucratic terrorist. There's the BLM. Those were the terrorists down here. And so they went with a new ploy. They played their ace. And the ace of these people is to cry race. And racism is, of course, a deplorable thing in its real sense. But we need to be careful that we don't just follow along. And I saw a lot of that this week from some people who should know better. Yes.
I'll attest to that in this one area. Since I've been back, I've been pretty open with what I was doing down there. I've been talking about it. The only phone calls I got from the media is, what do you think about his comment about race? That's the only phone call I got. They didn't care what I did down there. They didn't care what I've seen. They asked the one event that I wasn't present at, and they wanted my opinion on it. That's all they cared about. That's the only media attention I got from my point of view. That seems to show that what they're doing is they're helping with the race bait. They're baiting you into to make conversation about race. Because when it comes down to liberty, the government's losing. And so they're grasping at something that they can control. They're hanging that little carrot out there to get everybody riled up. And that's exactly what it is. What you're witnessing now is the media and the government participating in race bait. Because in order for the government to control the people, they must divide the people. That's the nature of government.
Yeah, question.
Two things, if I might, really quickly. One, we have the Freedom of Information Act. We should be able to get all communication that happened during that time and get it public. And two, there's horrible communications. I tried 5 times on 5 different web pages to get my body down there, and nobody responds to anything. And I'm not in a situation where I can just go wandering around in the woods.
Right.
So we need better communication. We need to get copies of those.
And I don't know if they will readily, because they're so lawless in these actions, I don't know if they're really going to cooperate with that or not, but the communications front...
Oh yeah, we can get you those documents in about 7 years.
Yeah. But the communication, and this is exactly what we experienced down there, was the complete lack of communication. And that's one thing that, as we build the coalition, and actually us here are working on the communications team within the Coalition of Western States, because we were there, and that's largely what we were doing, was dealing with communications and getting information out. And I felt the same way going down there. I'm like, why is there no coordinates? Why do I not know where to go? And so going forward, as we get organized, and as incidents like this come up in the future where people need to rally together, I think it's fair to say that the goal of the coalition will be to be a foundation point where people can go and get information, where there's a page that says, here's what's happening, here's how you can help, here's where you can go. And that kind of organization, that's why it's really encouraging to see, not just a few of us gathering, but a large coalition that's represented by, by national leaders and state legislators and patriots and people who are willing to jump in and be a part of this. So I would encourage everybody to try and get on board with that as well.
In brief, we're working on it.
Okay.
Operation Mutual, they put the fallout first, and a lot of people